Hello, my name is Charlotte Steele. Today I'm going to be talking about the sport surfing. I'm going to be talking about sport injury preventions, particularly for surfing, as well as common skills needed for the sport, common injuries related to the sport, and an effective injury prevention proposal for the specific sport of surfing. What is surfing, you ask? Surfing is specifically navigating and riding the waves up to the shore from out in the ocean. Surfing is an extremely popular sport and is also regarded as a safe sport for the most part, as there are low risk for injuries, although the injuries that are present are actually pretty severe. My own sister actually has taken up surfing. She has dealt with a few back injuries and actually swimmer's ear and injuries in her knee herself. So that kind of gave me motivation for wanting to do the sport surfing. When it comes to surfing, it's extremely important to be aware of a few things. It's important to be prepared to know yourself, your surroundings, and the sport, to do some research, get a good idea of what you plan to do before you start engaging in surfing. It's also important to be aware of surfing etiquette, such as the distance between yourself and another surfer, allowing every surfer to catch their own waves, etc. It's important to also use proper gear and discernment of your environment, otherwise you increase your risk for injury. It's also important to ensure that you warm up, stretch, and are engaging in a proper training program to decrease the potential injury. So some of the potential injuries that can occur while surfing include lacerations when coming into contact with objects, creatures in the water, or one's own board, potential head trauma from what I just said, concussion, spine, face, jaw, neck, and skull fractures, the surfboard tip itself, body bruising, shoulder strain, as well as sea creatures, cramps, and sunburn. Some of the factors that cause injury include the wave height and power, seafloor and reefs, sand contact with force, which has spinal fracture potential. Cervical trauma can happen when body surfers or bodyboarders because of them hitting head first in a shore break. Rip currents. Drowning isn't usually an issue because of the surfboard, but some causes of drowning can include head trauma, loss of consciousness, heart attack, or epileptic seizure. Overcrowding surf spots are often an issue. Lack of preparation, such as lack of training, warm-up, hydration, can cause injury. Muscle disorders, tendinitis, storms, and most injuries occur because of one's own surfboard, which is interesting. Again, as I said earlier, most injuries that a surfer faces are instigated by their own board. They're caused by lacerations of the surfboard fins, as well as sharp fins, the board, and the nose. 3/4 of surfing injuries occur on their head and limbs. 93% are lacerations. 22% of surfers are girls, and of the 22%, 50% of injured surfer girls are less than 20 years old. So the vast majority of surfing injuries could have been prevented by simple measures and adaptations of the surfer's equipment, such as using a nose guard or a tail guard, such as using maybe a soft board with a rounded shape to prevent injury of the tip of the nose, inflatable boards, soft-edged fins to prevent lacerations, or even finless surfboards are an option. You could also purchase a removable leash to prevent entanglement of the leash when caught in a wave, for example. Helmets can also be used to protect from brain damage, as well as an inflatable wetsuit, a vest, and it's also important to ensure that you are focusing on obeying the flags, warning signs in the area, and surfing etiquette to protect yourself as well as other surfers in the area. So currently there isn't a lot of regulation or on prevention for injury for surfers. There's no specific injury prevention program, though many physical therapy places or the general recommendation is that surfing etiquette provides some regulation to prevent injury, as well as following a functional fitness program is extremely important. Maintaining flexibility, strength, endurance, and mobility are large factors in ensuring the prevention of injury. The need for an injury prevention program is especially high among competitive surfers, as competitive surfers present a higher risk of sustaining surfing-related injuries than recreational surfers. It's also important that an injury prevention program be instituted because the majority of injuries tend to occur in more experienced surfers as they tend to take on more challenging waves. Older surfers, more advanced surfers, and those surfing larger waves are at an even more increased risk for significant injury. In that case, it's important to ensure that surfers are aware of current advisements and recommendations for their sport and do the best that they can to adhere to these. Also, it's important to, as I'll say on later, add a few extra steps into their routine to ensure that they're also preventing injury while maintaining the best experience they can and performing the best they can in the water. So when it comes to an injury prevention proposal, these are some things that might be included directly from some physical therapists themselves in regard to effective injury prevention techniques. They recommend don't rotate through the knees. Surfing requires significant range of motion and stability across many major joints. A good amount of surfers start developing injuries when they get stuck in a specific movement pattern. To start with, for example, knees can take a terrible beating while surfing. If your knees are feeling sore, you're not going to produce as powerful turns, and as a surfer, it's critical to have a healthy knee joint and quality strength throughout the muscles of the legs and hips. When you're surfing, your knees can get into some really awkward or unnatural positions that put too much strain on your knee joints. Relying on just your knees to produce the force you need to make those turns can cause a lot of pain in your knee joint. These issues could range from damage to your cartilage, your ligaments, your tendons, all around your knee joint, and have an effect on your knee to the point where it's starting to misalign. It's also important to activate muscles above the knees instead. Consider moving through your entire body as you cut and turn through the waves. One solution to help your knees out would be to rotate your shoulders and trunk instead, like for example, rotating your chest and rib cage when paddling. Flowing from turn to turn also involves leading with your shoulders and hips. When leading into like a really tight turn, it's really important to focus on using your hips. Getting low, staying balanced while tube riding also requires a lot of hip, knee, and ankle flexibility and strength. Surfing tends to create tight hip flexors, the muscles surrounding your hips, because straddling the board keeps those muscles contracted for long amounts of time. Having tight hips can restrict how well you rotate during a turn. When this happens, it goes back to that knee pain. You'll tend to compensate for the force needed to turn by using your knees, which will tend to strain them. So to surfers, it's important to increase hip flexibility and strength, which can help with the fundamental squat position even when they're standing on their surfboard. They'll see better stability and more lower body control when they're out there surfing. Another critical point to focus on is the prevention of shoulder impingement. This can be done through the strengthening of the rotator cuff muscles because surfers tend to have a high risk for overusing and putting too much strain on their shoulders. When they're surfing, they're constantly pulling their shoulders forward in the water, and over time this becomes a habit and they begin to stretch and irritate the muscles around the shoulder. Paddling also strengthens certain muscles in the shoulder while weakening the rotator cuff muscles, the supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, and subscapularis. This tends to lead to a type of injury known as shoulder impingement, which occurs when you constantly compress the rotator cuff tendons of your shoulder with a lot of overhead movement, such as paddling. Strengthening the muscles that surround the back of your shoulders will take the stress off of those overused muscles in the front, and then working on balancing pressure across your shoulder muscles prevents inflammation or pain that could have come from having your shoulder impinged. Paddling also takes a lot of power and flexibility coming directly from your back and core. If you consider how your entire body moves when you paddle, the surfer will tend to put a lot of less stress on certain parts of their body and begin to utilize the major muscle groups that they need to swim properly. And doing this, they'll be able to increase strength and flexibility across their entire body. So now, coming from the National Academy of Sports Medicine, as I'm also a personal trainer, I'm able to observe muscle imbalances, and as a kinesiologist, I've gone through Dr. Sally's applied movement anatomy, and it's important to focus on specific muscle groups, target the muscles that are weak and stretch the muscles that are tightened. So specifically, the rotator cuff provides dynamic stability and control, for example. If there's a muscular imbalance between the rotator cuff in relation to the scapula and clavicle, then impingement might happen. Proper scapular thoracic motion must occur to ensure a proper length tension ratio of the rotator cuff muscles. So to maximize the range of motion, it's important to foam roll and do static stretching. Correcting dysfunctional movement patterns is critical at first before progressing to active and dynamic stretching, which will help prepare the surfer for the fast-paced real-life movements in the water. Correcting dysfunctional movement patterns in not just the shoulder but the whole body includes inhibiting, lengthening, and activating muscles in a proper corrective and eventually dynamic strength program. So when it comes to preventing injuries through a corrective exercise program, surfers should be able to progress through motor control, isolated stretching, and integrated dynamic movements. Implementing exercises integrating motor control development, core control, and exercises preventing scapular winging are important, and this can be done through the strengthening of the serratus, the prevention of kyphosis by strengthening of the posterior deltoid, supraspinatus, and trapezius, for example. Once proper motor control has been attained along with scapular stability, strengthening exercises can then be integrated. Strengthening the external rotators, the infraspinatus and teres minor, for example, are critical for the prevention of shoulder impingement, and it's important for the surfer to ensure that they only maintain the strength ratio of 66 to 75% of external to internal strength. This will prevent injuries from muscular imbalances. So for example, core activation, balance, and proprioception exercises should also be included to prevent injury in these muscles. The total training of intensity, frequency, duration, or a combination of all the above should not be increased more than 10% per week. Balance, strength, and power exercises might also decrease the risk of strains, particularly with strengthening the muscles around the thigh and hip. Another area to focus on, anterior tilt. To prevent anterior tilt, which the body of the surfer naturally goes into due to hips locking around the board, which makes the lumbopelvic hip complex move into a persistently flexed position, and the arch of the back bringing the lumbar spine into constant extension, which tightens the hip flexors and back extensors. It's important to ensure that these muscles are stretched, whereas the muscles on the opposite sides, which tend to be lengthening, need to be strengthened. In other words, it's important to focus on these specific areas. Anterior pelvic tilt is also known as lower cross syndrome, and it can cause hamstring strain and anterior knee and low back pain, again, because of the increased lumbar extension and decreased hip extension. Specifically talking about the muscles involved, this is due to the gastroc, soleus, hip flexors, adductors, latissimus dorsi, and erector spinae being short and tight and needing to be stretched, whereas the anterior and posterior tibialis, glute max, glute medius, transversus abdominis, and internal oblique are lengthened and need to be strengthened. While it's also very important to focus on physical healing, it's important to also remember that the body is more than just the physical aspect. So when we're working with an athlete down the road, it's important to remember that they're an entire person, that they have a soul, a spirit, and a body too, that they have a mental well-being, a spiritual well-being, a physical well-being, an emotional well-being that all need to be healthy for them to even want to work on their physical. And some of the other areas like spiritual is way more important to focus on the well-being of that than even physical. So it's important to have your priorities in check and remember which parts of you need to be healed. It's important to remember that it's not about us, that the healing that we have is only given by Him, and that we can only do what we can do through Him and by Him, and that He's the one that ultimately brings healing to our patients. And He protects us, He loves us, He wants to support us through it, He wants to see us be healed and be healthy. So I chose Psalm 23 and Psalm 91, which are crucial and very dear to me verses. Psalm 23 was one I had memorized since I was a young kid, and it just reminds me that He's always with me, that no matter what I'm going through, it's important to remember that the holistic approach involves your spiritual life, your emotional life, and your mental life, and God wants all of those to be healthy as well, and that He is always with you, He loves you, and that He wants to come alongside you and protect you. And so for Psalm 91, it talks about God being there and protecting you from the evil one, and you got to remember that with Him, no one is against us. Like through His power, we are given strength. He works through us each and every day. And while we may want to be focused on all the physical aspects right now as kinese majors, as science majors, it's important to remember that God wants our entire bodies, mental, spiritual, and physical, and all the aspects of our well-being to be fully healed so He can work through us fully.